Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about Thomas Leitch's book, Engagements with Adaptation. So Thomas is one of the, I would say, premier adaptation theorists working today, and I'm an adaptation studies person. I did actually get to briefly meet Thomas digitally, I think in 2020, 2021, somewhere around there. I want to say for the Association for Adaptation Studies, we were on a conference panel together. And the reason that I mention that is because I'm writing a scholarly review of this book. And for that review, the book review editor wanted me to be upfront about the fact that I have met Thomas. Normally, it's not something that I would particularly care about that much. But it is interesting, sort of right within the world of scholarly publishing and book reviewing, there are concerns about reviewers who have too close a connection with the people that they are reviewing for, right? So if I were to review a book by Ryan Claycomb, right, who was my dissertation chair, a lot of scholarly publications would be very cautious about that because they would assume that there's at least the possibility that my review would be unnecessarily favorable because of that personal connection. So that's an interesting thing. That has nothing to do with the book itself. It has to do with my particular positioning as a reviewer of this book. But Engagements with Adaptation, I think, is a really, really interesting and useful introduction to the field of adaptation studies. And Leitch starts with a problem in adaptation studies, which, interestingly enough, so within adaptation studies, there's this interesting phenomena where we have a set of things that are the catechism of adaptation studies, one might say, right? These sort of things that people who write about adaptation studies and who write adaptation studies theory in particular keep coming back to and reiterating. And we say them over and over and over again. One of them is, as Leitch puts it, of adaptation studies, for better or worse, it has not followed cinema studies in becoming a discipline of its own. Instead, it remains a non-discipline, even an anti-discipline, a decidedly marginal field of study if it is indeed really a field. The marginalization of adaptation studies begins with the exceptional reluctance of its leading practitioners to define its subject. This is a very common refrain in adaptation studies theory, that the people who work on adaptation studies often are unwilling or unable to provide satisfactory definitions of what adaptation actually is and what the scope of adaptation studies as a field does. I actually talked about this. I don't remember, to be honest, I don't remember if it made it into the final draft of my dissertation, but in the introduction to my dissertation, which is an adaptation studies dissertation, I talked about this in at least one of the drafts, how what adaptation studies does, the subject of our inquiry is consistently ill-defined in ways that it is not for other critical fields, right? Like feminism, post-colonialism, psychoanalytic criticism. These things, for instance, all have pretty clearly delineated, if sometimes greater or lesser, focuses. Adaptation studies tends, for whatever reason, to avoid a clear definition of what it is, what it does, what its methodology is, etc., etc. So this is one starting point for a lot of adaptation scholars, and that's essentially what Engagements with Adaptation is about. However, Leitch does not really answer the question, right? Leitch does not really say, this is what adaptation studies is. What he instead does is he says, here are 6 major branches of adaptation studies, and a sort of survey of their general concerns, major practitioners, key questions and methodologies, etc., right? So here's a survey of what adaptation scholars today are doing. And these 6 categories he identifies are aesthetic, intertextual, industrial, biological, sociological, and participatory. Now, I'm going to talk about each of these, but I think this is a really good framing, actually, for what Leitch seems to be trying to do here, which is to introduce the field of adaptation studies, particularly for non-experts in the field. So, while it's useful for people like me, because there are approaches to adaptation studies in here that I have not really engaged with, that I, in some cases, wasn't even really aware of, but the book itself is really sort of designed for grad students or advanced undergrads. And I say this for 2 reasons. One is, at the end of the introduction, he says, so why study adaptation using any or all of these 6 approaches? This book's primary goal is to invite you both to consider adaptations more thoughtfully and resourcefully on your own terms, and to engage the urgent questions they raise about the powers and limitations of literary canons, the industry behind textual production and distribution, the relations between different kinds of media, the nature of national, political, racialized, gendered, and cultural identities, and the ways contemporary digital and social media have profoundly complicated the roles of producers and consumers of texts. Adaptations are worth studying not only because they are engaging on their own, but because the family relationship between adaptation studies and a host of other disciplines has the power to open the doors to new ways of thinking, both about adaptation and about many other fields, texts, and assumptions you might otherwise never question. That, to me, does not sound like an invitation to scholars working in the field to engage with engagements in adaptation. It sounds to me, and this is not a criticism of the book, I think this is a really important thing, but this sounds to me, this idea of to invite you both to consider adaptations more thoughtfully and resourcefully on your own terms and engage the urgent questions they raise. That sounds like this is a book intended for adaptation studies classes and courses in which maybe critical theory as such is being introduced, whatever it is, right? But this is a student-centered book. And again, I think that's really, really useful. I'm not knocking it for that. But the other reason that I think that this is a student-centered book is because each section, not each chapter, each portion of the book, each section with a section heading, etc., has a set of questions after it. And that is not something that one typically sees in a scholarly monograph, but it is something one typically sees in a textbook. Now, most of the rest of the stuff one would typically expect in a textbook, things like illustrations, diagrams, etc. There's a few illustrations, a few pictures, but they're there to support the case study examples about particular adaptations, as opposed to like giving, a breakdown of the rhetorical triangle or whatever it is, right? So there's not a lot of the other stuff that goes into textbooks, but that sort of here's questions for further discussion is a very textbook strategy. So again, quite useful for students. And again, engaging in interesting, important information for people like me who work in adaptation studies. So the six categories, I do want to go through this quickly. So aesthetic engagement is the first category that Leitch mentions. And this is probably what most people would think of when they think of adaptation studies. And it is basically this sort of question of transmediality, essentially, right? The sort of question of like, all right, this is being adapted from a novel into a film. How is it working? What is its... What are the strategies, and often what are the limitations of film? Because as much as film studies-based adaptation scholars like Leitch, who's a film and novel or play to film studies person primarily, as much as they focus on fidelity criticism is the enemy. This is another big catechism in adaptation studies. We're all against fidelity criticism, justifiably, but we all have to sort of mention that we're against fidelity criticism, and we frequently have to mention that, ironically enough, everybody else is against fidelity criticism, but we feel the need to continually say, hey, I'm against fidelity criticism. It's a sort of signaling to other adaptation studies scholars that we are properly in the field. So that's aesthetic criticism, right? Is this sort of concern with how is one piece of art transferred to another medium of art, right? And this differs from intertextual engagement, which is the second form that Leitch talks about, which is, I would say, a much more critically interesting and useful, and probably even maybe more common, maybe not, approach to adaptation studies, where intertextual engagement looks at not singular relationships between texts. So Jane Eyre, the novel, gets adapted to Jane Eyre, the film, but intertextual engagement looks at a wide range of things that sort of merge together, right? So Frankenstein is a great example of this. Just recently, the new Benicio del Toro Frankenstein movie came out. I think it was Del Toro, right? Anyway, I haven't seen it. It looks cool. I've heard good things, but I haven't seen it yet. So you have the novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Then you have the 1931, I think it was 31, maybe 33, but I think it was 31, Universal Monster Movies film. And that completely changes the character of Frankenstein's monster, right? It's totally different. If you read the novel and then watch the movie, you're like, what the fuck have you done here, right? But the thing, and so that's a sort of aesthetic engagement, right? We can say, all right, here's what the novel does, here is what the film does, here's the differences, here are why those differences might exist, based on genre differences, based on differences between the early 19th century versus the 1930s, whatever it is, right? Cool. So that's aesthetic engagement. But then if we start to look at subsequent Frankenstein films, we see not only the influence of Mary Shelley's novel, but we see the influence of the 1931 Universal Monster Movies film. Right? So every depiction you see, when Bugs Bunny has somebody who's got green skin, bolts in the neck, etc., that's not from Mary Shelley. That's from the Universal Monster movie. Right? So we've got these sort of competing lines of influence, these multiple lines of textual engagement. And that's really what the intertextual approach to engagement is looking at. We've got the industrial approach to engagement, and I've done a little bit of work on this actually in my dissertation and first book, which was about the political economics of adaptation. Industrial engagement basically looks at adaptations as commercial products. So there is an adaptation industry, or industries more accurately, and the reason that companies, that artists, that whatever it is, produce adaptations is because they make money in specific ways. And so industrial engagement looks at adaptation as a process or product or service within the capitalist structure. And it says, here is how these things are measured, how they are engaged, why they exist, etc., in order to make money in specific ways. And there's biological engagement. This one seems to me like a much more fraught enterprise. It's not one that I've engaged with much. Biological adaptation attempts to map literary or artistic or cinematic adaptation according to the principles of theoretically Darwinian evolution, but actually, I don't think I'm going to be able to find it quite yet. But Leitch argues that it's not so much Darwinian evolution as evolution associated with a different theorist of evolution, whose name I cannot remember because that is not my field. I am not a biologist. But so basically this idea is sort of, this field of engagement is rooted in the idea that as texts undergo changes between different time periods, media, cultural contexts, etc., they evolve in similar ways to how organic beings evolve. And this is fraught in many ways, and Leitch seems to be the most critical of this, because there are some legitimate problems with this way of looking at things. Next is sociological engagement, which is a very much culturally focused, cultural studies type approach, where basically it sees adaptations as crossing borders, and these adaptation theorists attempt to interrogate what that means. What does it mean for, say, Shakespeare to be transculturated into an Indian film through Bollywood or something like this, right? What does it mean for Sundiata to be refracted through Disney, right? This Malian epic being sort of refracted into The Lion King, right? What do these things mean? What do they do? Why do they do these things? And how do both the originating culture and the receiving culture of those adaptations conceptualize those adaptations? And then finally, participatory engagement. This is primarily a contemporary approach to adaptation, but not exclusively contemporary. And basically, this is a system that looks at how people enact adaptation through things like fandoms, fan fiction, online discussion forums that create canon, but also through engaged performances and things like this, right? So this is basically a way of sort of looking at what it means and how it changes the nature of adaptation when we do not have an artist or a company or whatever it is dictating the nature of that adaptation, when it's not written by a specific author, created by a specific film company, whatever it is, but when it is sort of communally open to growth, revision, reconceptualization, etc. So again, I think it's a really, really good introduction to a wide range of approaches to adaptation studies. Yeah, super, super interesting.